Hi, I'm Jeff Chopin from the University of Rochester, and this is my presentation on the talk entitled Exploring Qualities of a Community of Inquiry in a Synchronous Online Course. There we are. This comes from the SyncOn project, which was Synchronous Online Professional Development for Middle Grades Mathematics Teachers in Rural Contexts, an NSF-funded project. I'm a PI, Cindy Callard, also from the University of Rochester, is another PI, and Julia Amador from the University of Idaho is the other PI. We have 4 research assistants listed here, doctoral research assistants. The project is aimed at taking online, face-to-face professional development and making it online and delivering it to rural teachers who normally don't have access to high quality professional development. It's a 3-part model. And they're all sort of connected. But today we're going to focus on the one on the left, the Orchestrating Mathematical Discussions online course. And in this course, we based it on the 5 Practices book. We use Zoom and Google Docs to coordinate the activities and to hold the synchronous settings. And they worked on tasks, scenarios, and other activities to help them think about how to develop instructional practices to help students engage with high cognitive demand tasks. We video recorded the OMD sessions, there were 6 for each of them. The OMD 1 course, we used Panopto to record the Zoom window and Google Docs. Overall, there were 24 episodes for cohort 1 and 45 for cohort 2. Part of this is explained by the fact that in cohort 1 was our first try, and we actually lost some data along the way because of technical issues. We use conjecture maps to help us to think about how our designed environment would lead to certain processes, mediating processes, which would then ultimately lead to transformed instructional practices. And these mediating processes is what we use to quantify or characterize our cognitive presence in the community of inquiry framework. So here's what our conjecture map looked like. Rather, lots of words there, lots of text. But we start with a high-level conjecture on the left, which would ultimately lead to the outcomes on the far right. The second column is the design learning environment. The third column are the practices that result from the design learning environment and exist within the design learning environment that are ultimately transformative enough to lead to the end outcomes on the far right. And so there's 3 aspects of community of inquiry. There's social presence, teaching presence, and cognitive presence. And we made adaptations to each of those presences for the purposes of our project. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So teaching presence, there's 3 components, one of which we didn't look at for this because it was all stuff that was done before they'd go into the course, which was the design of the learning environment in terms of the tasks and how we were going to organize the activity. But the 2 that we focused on in this study is facilitating discourse, which were broken down to those 4 categories: identifying areas of agreement, reaching consensus, elicits contributions, presses and probes, and redirects direct discussion. The 2 that really came out the most there were elicits, contributions, and presses or probes. And the direct instruction are where the instructor was engaging in sort of directing activity, and you can see the 4 there. And explain content was and summarizes were the 2 big components in our data. Social presence, we focused on content-focused interactions, interactive aspects of discussion. And so the 2 codes that came out of that were building from or extending another participant's response and repeating or paraphrasing another participant's response. In terms of cognitive presence, we built from the mediating processes, the 4 mediating processes that we'd identified in our conjecture maps, which were explaining how features of a task promote access to the mathematics, explaining mathematics in a way that's connected, explaining anticipated strategies or misconceptions you might see when enacting a task, and then how teaching moves impact student access to the mathematics. And these were all things that we felt would derive from our learning environment, but were high level enough that they wouldn't by default occur, but would only occur if the teachers were engaging in high level activities within the design learning environment, high level practices. So we created transcripts of the OMD sessions, and then we took our codes and we would do a binary, it was there or not there for each turn. And then we did consensus coding, and then we did frequency counts of the teachers and participants across all of the different codes. And so what we were interested in terms of research was what aspects of teaching presence were evident. How did the teaching presence differ? What was the impact of the teaching presence in terms of interactive and direct instruction? To what extent did the participants in the two cohorts engage in mediating processes? And then how did they engage each other with content? So the social presence around the content-related interactions. That's the fourth question. And in terms of teaching presence, what we found was there were really big differences in the OMD1 course between the cohort 1 and cohort 2 instructors. Cohort 1 instructors were much more active in each of the lessons, each of the sessions. Quite a bit more, and the cohort 2 instructors were considerably less active. And the cohort 1 instructors were active across all aspects of teaching presence. And you can see the numbers in table 1. That even though there were fewer episodes, there was just a lot more teaching presence. And this we attribute to a number of things. There was a slight redesign from cohort 1 to cohort 2 of the course. But in addition to that, the lead instructor for cohort 1 and other aspects of the study also was much more likely to explain and suggest than other coaches or instructors. So there was partly a style thing. And in addition to that, there were fewer participants in cohort 1 in each of the sessions relative to cohort 2. So it's possible that there was some offloading going on in cohort 2 to the participants. And we see a bit that here, the participants in cohort 2 were considerably more active in terms of the cognitive presence category. And in general, the only category where there wasn't a lot more presence was the content-related interaction. The sort of what we would consider to be the significant social presence. But otherwise, they were generally just talking a lot more and in ways that were picked up by the codes. And so we are going to look at 2 participating teachers as cases, one from cohort 1, one from cohort 2, to also show how our codes picked up differences in participants. So the participant from cohort 1, Dixon, had the second highest number of codes from this cohort, and with the highest number of cognitive presence and social presence code. And so much of his social presence codes were not from the 2 things that we were looking at, but were related to vulnerabilities, sort of talking about his practices in a way that was exhibiting some sort of admission that he was struggling with some aspects of his conversation. And quite a bit of the turns coded as cognitive presence explain the impact of teachers' actions, and often using examples from his class rather than from the scenarios that we had given them to study. He was introspective with respect to his teaching and describing situations in which he was struggling in a rather self-effacing way. But he did not often describe or analyze the mathematical strategies, which was one of the things that we'd hoped that he would talk about, rather than his failures or challenges in his classroom. And then Fleming was the cohort 2 participant. He talked more about the mathematical strategies. She had a slightly below average number of contributions for that cohort. But she was higher in cognitive presence and content-related interactions, so things that we were looking for. So she seemed to be focusing in on the aspects of the learning environment that we had set up that we hoped she would. Part of the social banter was Dixon's, just simply showing that an online learning environment captures much of the same aspects of learning and teaching. as you would expect in a face-to-face environment in terms of interaction and social banter and the like. Okay. So and just to kind of wrap up, I know this is relatively brief, but hopefully we'll have time to talk about it. We employed a community of inquiry framework, which allowed us to see differences between the two cohorts enrolled in the same course. It allowed us to conjecture about the relationship between the instructors were doing and the ways that the participants interacted in the environment. We focused on, we were trying to derive insights on how how the courses allowed participants to engage in content-related interactions. So recognizing and building from the contributions of others, which we feel is significant in intellectual move process in any environment. And cognitive presence, sort of engaging in those practices that we felt were important for transforming their instructional practice once they left us. In both cohorts, they engaged in both social and cognitive presence. And the instructors in cohort 1 were just in generally more active, doing explaining and modeling, and showing the high level building from social interaction relating to building from others' contributions. And giving feedback. And the participants in cohort 2 were had considerably higher rates of cognitive and social presence. When we looked at OMD2, the instructors were those from the OMD1 cohort 1 course, and those distributions of turn taking looked a lot more like cohort 1 than cohort 2 for OMD1, which is what this study was on. So we adapted the framework for community of inquiry in 3 substantial ways. And we feel these are the big contributions of this paper. So in terms of social interactions, we focused on content-related interactions, which we felt were high leverage practices, which in terms of developing collective knowledge and a feeling of collective intellectual work in the community. Secondly, we used mediating processes to quantify or characterize cognitive presence. And this allowed us to talk about cognitive presence in a specific and meaningful way within the context of the learning environment that we set up, rather than in the more generic way that's discussed in the original community of inquiry work. And the third adaptation was focusing on interactive teaching. So focusing on how they were eliciting and probing and building from the contributions of participants. And direct instruction, those were sort of the 2 competing teaching components of greatest interest to us. And we feel that those are useful for continuing to study online learning environments. And that is that.